Once again, we're joined by our good friend Salim Mansur, Professor Emeritus at Western University in London, Ontario. And we're going to be talking today about Canada's involvement in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And we've covered this before, Salim. We've identified that Canada has no distinctly Canadian foreign policy since the First World War, since the inception of Canada, but more recently since Prime Minister Pearson's Nobel Peace Prize for helping to create the United Nations emergency force over the Suez Crisis over 60 years ago, before I was born. Until today, we follow our betters in the United Nations and NATO, wherever they lead us. What has changed, though, I think, over the years, is the moral direction of Western nations. We're not the same country we used to be. From fighting communists in Korea, as my father did, we're now siding with corrupt neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. From once advocating for negotiations, remember peacemaking? The conflicts in the war, we would say, let's negotiate, sit down, talk it out. We're now saber-rattling with Russia, a nuclear power. And where we protected our national sovereignty, we're now the world's first post-national state, according to Justin Trudeau, with no core identity to protect. So what do? We promote a one-world totalitarian government. We've become what we fought against. So I have to ask you, Salim, how did we get from peacemaker to warmonger?
I think the transition that has taken place with a great demarcating point in contemporary history, that is the end of the Cold War. Until the Cold War, Canada was very much seen as and saw itself as, going all the way back, as you said in your remarks, to the Suez Crisis of 1956. This October, it seemed that the great crisis in modern history has come about in October. So in October, the Suez Crisis in 1956 broke out 66 years ago. And the role that Foreign Minister at that time, Lester Pearson, played in Louis St. Laurent's Liberal government was one for which he later received the Nobel Prize. Nobel Peace Prize. The role he played, that is Canada played, was a role of taking a lead position within the United Nations and as an ally of the United States, as a member of NATO, but as a UN member state, to bring about a mediated settlement of the Suez Crisis that broke out in 1956, a war that was launched with the Israeli invasion towards the Suez Canal. And that invasion was the excuse by which the British and the French troops were being sent to the Suez Canal area.
And it must be remembered, Salim, as well, sorry for the interruption, that Israel just didn't invade the Suez for no reason. It was in response to Egypt nationalizing the Suez Canal Company, which was basically owned by British and French shareholders, right? So they went in because now you had this Arab state controlling that vital canal that was built not by Egypt per se, but by the French and English.
Well, you're right. But if you get into the weed, we have to then get into the weed, and we are not wanting to do that.
Let's not get into the weeds.
But just since you raised that issue, the weed is this was post-1945 world. Britain was no longer the empire that had begun to end with the withdrawal in independence of India. France was defeated in Vietnam, that is Indochina, after 1954 in Dien Bien Phu, and France was engaged in an anti-colonial war, the colonialist uprising for independence in Algeria, in North Africa, an Arab state. And Britain had basically given up its empire. The empire was gone. It was a residue of an empire. And yes, the Suez Canal was, in that sense, a French project in the 19th century in which the British invested and eventually came to control in the 19th century. But the question at that point in time is wrapped up in this anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggle that was taking place. And the 56, when Israel launched that operation, now we know because the records are out, the British documents are out, the French documents are out. This was a collusion. It was the British and the French that got the Israelis to invade. That would be the pretext, just like the pretext now to get Ukraine into NATO, knowing, the red line, knowing that that would get the Russian to respond. So the pretext was set. You see, you need a casus belli, a pretext in which to then go into operation. And the point here is that, and I won't go into the weed, but the main thing I want to drive is in 1956 and lead up to the Suez War, that is the post-1945 world, Canada took a position, that is the Louis Saint Laurent government took a position on the Suez Crisis, and they played the role of a mediating and settling that crisis with the support of America. Without America, there wouldn't have been that role that Canada would or could have played, that is the Eisenhower government. But it played that role that went against Canada's self-identity as a Commonwealth country, as a country whose head of state is the monarch of Britain, that is Canada's monarch, and there was a lot of, if you go back and look at that history and the debate, there was a lot of resistance among the Anglo-Canadian. What are we doing? We are standing against our mother country. Again, the flag was being raised about the mother country, and Canada has to respond accordingly, line up behind not only mother country Britain, but mother country France. They were the two mother countries, line up behind it. And what we have talked about in the past, which I have laid it out, Canada has been at the forefront, as we have said, as I've said, a vassal state, always lining up behind the Union Jack. Whatever Britain does, Canada is right behind, going all the way back to the Boer War at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. What was our interest to take on the Boers, the Dutch settlers in South Africa? It was because, we were lining up behind our mother country, that is Britain, the Anglo-Canadian. The same thing happened with the outbreak of World War I. We were right there, the Anglo-Canadian. The French refused to go. The Anglo-Canadians were right there, saluting and ready to march. And the same thing happened in World War II. Again, the French did not join. There was a conscription issue, but the Anglo-Canadians were right gung-ho to go. And so in 1956, this was a radical departure. If you look at it in that perspective of history, looking back, we took a position against Britain in the sense that we did not accept the British argument and the French argument. We went along with the United Nations. In fact, we played a key role in the United Nations to put together eventually what became a peacekeeping force, to send Canadian troops to separate the warring parties, and the rest is history. The nationalization of Suez Canal was not reversed, was not revoked. Suez Canal is now, a part of the Egyptian state. And I might just to close this point off, might say the same thing about the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was built by the American Theodore Roosevelt. But, fast forward into the 20th century, finally, Jimmy Carter signed the Panama Canal Agreement and handed it over back to Panama, you see? So, yes, that was the colonial age and so on and so forth. But coming back to our present situation, Canada has departed. Until the end of the Cold War, Canada was a major peacekeeping country. The only war that Canada went into, and again, under the UN flag, was the Korean War. That was a mission that was put together by the United Nations as a Uniting for Peace resolution. and the command for the enforcement action to push back the North Koreans, supported by Russia, Soviet Union, and Communist China, to push them back beyond the 38th parallel, was a UN policy, and Canada participated with it, along with, I suppose, something like 20 countries that sent its forces there. Countries like Turkey, Pakistan was involved in it, that is countries that were Western oriented, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So what happened after the end of the Cold War? What has happened, and now we can look back upon it, that missions and operations have taken place without the UN authorization, but with Canada's participation under NATO flag. NATO is a treaty organization, North America Treaty Organization.
North Atlantic.
North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with member states primarily, if not wholly, European states. And Canada and United States are the two North American states that are member of NATO. And so post-Cold War, that is post-1992, the operations that have taken place, significant operation that has taken place in the name of humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect R2P, as it came to be designated in the early 20th century, and by the way, in which Canada played a significant role, that is the Jean Chrétien government played a significant role to put together what has now become part of the United Nations document, charter, that is responsibility to protect, a formula that was developed after the Rwandan genocide, when there was no effort on the part of the UN to launch an operation to protect the Rwandan people who were threatened, and who then subsequently we saw what happened, or we witnessed what happened. But the major operations in places like the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, mid-1990s, the Libyan and Syrian operation after the Iraq War, and I'll come to the Iraq War in a moment, that is a 2003 Iraq War, that was a regime change in Baghdad with Saddam Hussein. But the Libyan and the Syrian operation, the operation in Serbia that led to the dismantling of the Serbian state with the independence for Kosovo, self-determination for Kosovo. These were all NATO operation and regime change operation in which Canada participated under the NATO flag. And the legality of these operations are all open to question, because a NATO operation does not belong to the same category as is an operation under the UN flag or UN authorization, because that would be part of the international law. This is a treaty organization of North Atlantic member states. So what we then have is Canada operating or lending support to NATO headquarters, Brussels, and as a NATO member, taking a position in support of NATO missions. But when it came to the Iraq War of 2003, there was the debate once again, the question of weapons of mass destruction with Saddam Hussein, a regime change, and so on and so forth. And resolutions were moved at the UN Security Council that led to the most penetrating and rigid investigation of Saddam's inventory on weapons of mass destruction. And these were conducted under the UN Security Council resolution of 1441, in which all the veto members had signed on to, that is the 5 permanent members were signed on to, along with other members who were the non-permanent members sitting in the council at that time. But it was not a resolution authorizing military action. And so when the question came up about authorizing military action, after the famous presentation by Colin Powell at the UN Security Council, holding up a white file of white powder, saying that this is a weapon of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein have, and other possible weapons that he had that he has hidden away, and demanded UN authorization. France indicated that France would veto it, and that authorization. So there was no motion moved by the United States or by United Kingdom, that is Tony Blair's government. Both of them were gung-ho about regime change in Iraq. And so they did not move the resolution, because the resolution would have been vetoed and defeated. France had clearly stated that. Possibly Russia and China would have joined in the same sort of vetoing it. And without the UN authorization, the war in 2003 was launched. What was Canada's position on that? Prime Minister Jean Chrétien had gone into supporting the Operation Enduring Freedom. That was the code name for the war in Afghanistan, the regime change in Afghanistan after 9/11. But on the question of Iraq, Jean Chrétien refused. Jean Chrétien said that this is not a UN Security Council, UN mission. There is no authorization of the UN. Therefore, this is going to be an illegal operation. It will not have the backing of international law as we understand it since 1945. So that is a clear precedent that was set up for Canada, by a liberal government, a liberal prime minister. And we did not participate in the Iraq war. So the question emerges, where are we on this situation that is gradually escalating heading into very troubling grounds? There have been, loose talk of nuclear deployment, 60th anniversary after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Western powers are saying that Russia might use, nuclear weapon, tactical nuclear weapon, battlefield nuclear weapon. These are all projections. Russia has not said that. Putin has not said that. There's never been any statement on the part of Putin that they're going to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. But why are these signals being made? Is it because are the NATO country now preparing to deploy nuclear weapon if it comes to that need that the Russian forces have basically rolled over and will possibly roll over all the way, if it need to be, to the capital and beyond, and the Ukraine war is most definitely in that sense over. These are the delayed actions that are taking places. So these are all very concerning. The effects of this war is not limited to the Black Sea region. It has consequences way beyond the Black Sea region, into Europe, into the Middle East, into Africa, and far beyond. If it comes to some sort of a nuclear weapon deployed in a tactical nuclear weapon deployed in Ukraine. And what is Canada's position? We haven't had a discussion about this matter in the Parliament, and Canada has gone along completely with, that is, this current government, this current prime minister has gone along completely in this Ukraine war, its buildup and its subsequent support for it in terms of material and financing, according to the reports that I have seen and what is put up in the Global Affairs website. We have already invested over $1 billion either in distribution or promises made of further expenditure. Plus we have been providing military training. Canadian Armed Force personnel are right now in European theaters working with Ukrainian military, providing them training, providing them logistic support, providing them with material.
Couldn't Russia consider our support of the Ukrainian side in this conflict to be a belligerent act? and declare us a combatant or belligerent in this conflict. We're treading very on thin ice here.
You took the words out. That's where I was trying to, wrap it up. That is, we are now a belligerent state, a co-belligerent state, and if this war breaks out into a larger conflagration, given the role of some of the European states like Poland, like Germany and others who have deployed men and equipment in Ukraine, and then that leads to that conflagration with Russia taking action against these states, then we are also involved in that situation, and we don't know where this will head up, but this has all the potential of becoming a wider war. It is already not simply a military action, it has got the whole dimension of economic, financial, resource problems involved in this war that we're looking at it, and there is very little discussion. Here I might say that the Canadian media that was bought over with the first installment of payment by Justin Trudeau of $600 million, and the subsequent payments that have been made have made the media simply the propaganda arm of the Canadian government. And by Canadian government, I now mean all of the political parties that are sitting in the parliament, because there is no discussion, there is no questioning, there is no, role of the opposition asking those very fundamental questions. What is the national interest of Canada in this matter? What is our objective? The issues are beginning to now percolate in American politics. In less than 2 weeks, America is going to go into its midterm election. And if, as is very likely, the Republican Party takes over the House of Representatives, and there is now even talk that they will take over possibly the Senate, and the Republican Party therefore hold the Congress as the majority party, Kevin McCarthy, the leader of the Republican wing party in the House, has already gone on record this week saying that there will be no aid anymore going to Ukraine.
That's marvelous. As a matter of fact, if you bring it back to Canada, there is a politician and a political party that is opposed to this involvement by Canada and NATO in Ukraine, and that, of course, is the People's Party, Maxime Bernier, who, when I interviewed him here in my house, actually, back in May, said he's calling for negotiations. This is not our fight. We can help, as we've done in the past, to broker a peace, but Maxime is the only politician, unfortunately without a seat in Parliament, but that doesn't mean he's not influential, who's calling for a peace and stop the saber-rattling. Why is it just like one man, one party in this entire country with the sense to say something like that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Maxime is the only one, and possibly there are few voices like ours in the public that are talking and raising these questions, but the media is totally silent. And anybody who asks these very pertinent questions, very important questions, are and will be branded as Putin's shill, instead of looking at it in what is urgently needed in the world that we are in. Russia is not Iraq. Russia is not Libya. Russia is not Syria. Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. Russia was a military superpower that in the time of the Soviet Union, and though there is no longer any Soviet Union and Russia is not a communist country anymore, Russia still is a military power that cannot be taken lightly. And it is, as I repeat myself, has the largest nuclear stockpile. So this is not something that we can be so cavalierly dismissive of those who are questioning. There's a whole list of people in America, diplomats, people who have served in the State Department, in the Defense Department, former military officers like Colonel Douglas McGregor, Major Scott Ritter of the U.S. Marine Corps, former CIA officials like Ray McGovern, and academics with reputation in the field of both strategic studies, as experts in European affairs, Russian affairs, who have all spoken out, going all the way back to George Kennan, that pushing NATO eastward and opening the door to Ukraine is playing with fire. That is the red line. It cannot be crossed. And yet, the Biden administration and the people who have pushed this war have precisely done that. This was all understood. So where are the Canadians? How is it that the Canadians' voices that would have been, in a sense, similar to and consistent with the voices of those people, including Henry Kissinger, who's on record, going back to 2014, that, you cannot push NATO to the front porch of Russia. And that's where, are the Canadians asleep on this matter? Aren't there enough Canadians around with responsibility, experience, background, studies to concur with those Americans who have been working on these issues going all the way back to the Cold War years?
So who's pushing it? So who's pushing this, Salim? I mean, we've talked before about the neocons. Are these the people behind the scenes that are pushing the West into a conflagration with Russia?
Exactly. So what I agree, and I would say that this war, that Mr. Trudeau, Madame Freeland, and others who have taken this on and invested in it and have put all of Canada behind it without a vote in the Parliament, without an open discussion, are acting as the vassal of the World Economic Forum and are playing to the agenda of the neocon, who are on record that their project is to extend the unipolar moment of American history indefinitely into the future hegemony, and Russia is an impediment, and Russia needs to be dismantled.
Explain for our listeners, who are the neocons, Salim?
Well, neocons or neoconservatives is a movement that emerged in the 1980s, so to speak, during the Reagan administration, and it was focused upon, investing in policies that will not only roll back the Soviet Union from Eastern Europe, that is the Warsaw Pact country, the Iron Curtain that divided Europe since the end of World War II, not only roll it back. Remember President Reagan talking about bring down the wall, Mr. Gorbachev, or tear down the wall, that famous thing, in the mid-1980s. I believe it was in 1984. So roll back the Soviet Union, but ultimately dismantle the Soviet Union. That was the project. The people like George Kennan and others were about detente, about coexistence, about finding a way out to lower the threshold of the conflict between the East and the West Bloc countries at the heart of Europe. That was a language of containment. But the neocon became people who pushed further to dismantle it. And among the lead theorists of this agenda were Jews, American Jews, who you can trace back to their origin. They came from, or their parents and grandparents came from Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, that is that part of Europe before World War I was part of the Tsarist Empire, Russia, and Eastern Europe up to the Baltic Sea, that is Poland, Hungary, but mostly Poland and the Baltic state, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Belarusia. These were the Pale of Settlement where the Jews had made their home for centuries. They are the Ashkenazim Jews, or what was the leftover from a millennium ago, the Khazar dynasty, reputedly that had established a sort of a kingdom in what is parts of Ukraine, parts of Poland, parts of the Baltic states. But history moves on, and these were incorporated into the Russian Empire. They became, they were part of the Russian Empire. Then came the revolution, and in the revolution, the leading role of the Bolsheviks party that became the Communist Party, but the Bolsheviks in large numbers were Jews of this part of the world, that is Jews, Ashkenazim Jew of Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, and Russia. They played the leading role in the Bolshevik Party. Many of them, or most of them, were Jews, or they had Jewish connection and Jewish backing. And that history is a history that is rarely talked about because of all of the problems associated with that history. Who did the revolution? What was the revolution about? I mean, it was a Marxist communist revolution, but that revolution was anti-Christian. That revolution led to the destruction of the Tsarist family, that led to the destruction of the Orthodox Christianity, the destruction of churches, arrest and killing of priests, and so on and so forth. It's a very difficult and complex and horrific history. Then comes the period of Stalin, and under Stalin, the purges and counter-purges that took place, the Holodomor that took place in Ukraine in the early 1930s that led to, several million Ukrainians dead. Who were these Ukrainians? Most of these Ukrainians were Ukrainian peasants of Christian background, but they were not Russian, or even if some were Russian, most of them were part of that Ukrainian that were, more connected to the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Latvians and so on. Stalin himself was not a Jew, but he was a Georgian, but his senior members of his Politburo and his comrades, many, if not most of them, were people of Jewish background. And they're the ones carried out the orders or created the policies that led to the Holodomor. And then came the Second World War, the German attack, and the Ukrainians, those who had suffered under Stalin, they rose up as Ukrainian nationalists, and they participated on the side of the Germans, that is the Third Reich and Hitler's army, against the Soviets. And Ukraine was the killing field, the Badlands during that horrific period from 1941 till 1945, the end of the war. This is under this situation, in this context, you have the story of the history of Stephen Bandera and the Ukrainian nationalists who were, in that sense, against based upon race ideology. They were allied with the Germans, Nazis, and they carried out the horrific atrocities like the killings in Babi Yar or the Katyn massacre or during the war. And in the midst of all of that is people like Madame Freeland, Christia Freeland, her family, her ancestor, grandfather, and others who were, in that sense, members of or allied with the Ukrainian nationalists and served the German Nazis during the war in Ukraine, in Poland, in Eastern Europe. And then after the war, many of them were able to escape from that part of the world and found refuge in Canada, in the United States, and Australia, in Latin America. So we have a large Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, somewhere in the region of 1 million Ukrainian or people of Ukrainian origin. Not all of them are Ukrainian nationalists or supporters of Ukrainian nationalists who were allied with the German Nazis, but a great many of them are. Ukraine is another of those borderland countries with overlapping ethnic identities. Within Ukraine, it is a multi-ethnic society. There are Russian Ukrainians, and then there are non-Russian Ukrainians, Moldovans, Hungarians, Lithuanians, Polish, and so on and so forth.
Salim, what I'm trying to understand is how can neoconservatives, who are primarily Jewish, although they're not all Jews, would be siding with Ukraine in this conflict, having NATO go in protect Ukraine, when, as it's coming to be known here, I mean, not through the main press, but through academia, Ukraine is very much still neo-Nazi in its philosophy. Oddly enough, I mean, Zelenskyy is a Jew, but I mean, probably just as much as I'm a Catholic, which means no, he's not. I just saw a video the other day of one troop of, or platoon at least, of Ukrainian soldiers singing a song praising Bandera, and so how can you have this organization, loose organization of Jewish intellectuals promoting a conflict to protect neo-Nazis?
At a very simple level, it is the oldest formula. My enemy's enemy is my friend.
So there's a bigger picture here.
Yeah, I mean, so, my enemy's enemy in this sense is the Jewish neocons and those non-Jew neocons. I mean, there's a whole lot of them, like John McCain, the late senator, Lindsey Graham, who is his protege and is still there, who a few months ago, in the early days of the war, said that, we should get Putin assassinated, decapitated. These are all supposed to be, our leaders, the leaders of the Western world, acting as Don Corleone, mafia chief. And there are a whole lot of them in the Senate, on both sides of the political divide, that is Republican and Democrat, is a uniparty thing. I mean, the votes that took place on Biden's support for the Ukraine war effort in billions of dollars were voted upon by both the Republicans and the Democrats. There was a bipartisan support for these billions and billions of dollars that had been sent to Ukraine or promised to Ukraine, plus the war stock, war inventory that has been sent from the United States and then also from other NATO countries, including Canada. So that is a fact that my enemy's enemy is what has brought them together. The Ukrainian Nazis, the Ukro-Nazis, and the Jews makes the most bizarre relationship and alliance. But their objective for both of them is regime change in Moscow and ultimately the dismantling of Russia. These are, again, taboo subjects. These cannot be discussed. From the end of from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992, that is the end of the Cold War, through to the early 2000s, a decade of a complete despair for the Russian people and for the Russian society. What happened was a plunder and pillaging of Russia as a result under Boris Yeltsin. And in that plunder and pillaging of Russia, including the plunder and pillaging of Ukraine, a great many of the people who did those plundering and pillaging happened to be Russian Jews and Ukrainian Jews, oligarchs like Igor Kolomoisky, who basically owns Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky. Volodymyr Zelensky was his employee, so to speak, and he was put up to run for the election in 2019 to replace Pedro Poroshenko, who became the president after the coup of 2014 that removed Viktor Yanukovych, who was in that sense a Russian Ukrainian and in pro-Russian as opposed to being pro-European, pro-NATO, that Pedro Poroshenko was. Pedro Poroshenko was a Ukrainian Jew, as is Zelensky, but they were all in league with the Banderistas, the Stephen Banderas people, who we are talking about, the Ukrainian fascists or Nazis, and they were being supported right through, going all the way back to early 2000, by the Clinton administration, then the Bush administration, and finally the Obama administration, and now it is the Biden administration. And it is against their policy that we had this long list of people in America who have been deplatformed, from whom we do not hear much. You have to find them out in their own blogs or in their internet, in their writings that are not available in New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. So this is where it is. What we are seeing, what we talked about, the oligarchs in Ukraine or in Russia, well, what about the oligarchs in North America? What about the oligarchs like Bezos and Carlos Slim and others who have a crushing hold, a chokehold in our media? Rupert Murdoch of Fox News, the CNN, and others, and the whole list of ABC, NBC, MSNBC, and so on and so forth.
Salim,
what about Canadian? Where
I was just going to
are the alternate voices?
I just read a few days ago the transcript of a presser with Putin, and the media were, of course, in Russia, the media aren't free. In Canada, the media are not free. Don't kid ourselves. I was reading it, and you had TASS, you had Izvestia, you had RT, TV, and all them asking questions, and the questions were fawning softball questions. And as I was reading that, I'm going, this is Canadian press. When the Canadian press asks anything of Trudeau or Freeland, it's fawning softball questions. And Canada is very much no different than Russia in this respect. We don't have an independent press. We have some great people like Ezra and Andrew Lawton and True North and things like that. But still, our press, all of them are paid by our state. are puppets of our state, just like in Russia. And we have become what we once fought. And there's really no difference for us between Russia and Canada or the US. Probably US has a freer press, but it's still centrally controlled, more or less, Democrat in origin. So it's very odd that Canada and the United States and the West would single out Russia as being evil or bad when, on the face of it, we're not much different than they are now. We used to be, not now. So it comes back to the World Economic Forum and the globalist agenda. That's the only reason why we would be against Russia. It's not because of Putin. It's not because of the press. It's not because of anything like that. Remember, Zelenskyy got rid of the press. Zelenskyy got rid of 10, I think it was 10 opposition parties, gone. So he is a dictator in the truest sense of that word, and we're supporting him.
Zelenskyy has a kill list of people that if they can be reached, they would be eliminated by Zelensky's, secret arm. And among that list of people are Americans, people like Scott Ritter, But I want to come back to the original question, given how much time you have, Bob. Is about NATO and about, again, international law.
Yes.
In 1949, when Canada joined NATO, then our foreign minister, Lester Pearson, speaking at the inaugural of NATO and Canada's membership at NATO in April of 1949, this is what he said. He said, this treaty is not a pact for war. This treaty, that is NATO treaty, this treaty is not a pact for war, but a pledge for peace and progress. Okay. I just want to run very quickly to a few points about the history of NATO. So NATO was constructed with the idea and the objective and the principle to prevent any further advancement of the Soviet-led army that had come into Berlin at the end of the war, and which then was presented by Winston Churchill as the Iron Curtain has come down from the Baltics to the Adriatic, that famous speech that he gave in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, after he had been defeated as the Prime Minister of England. And NATO was a product of the containment policy to hold the Soviet army and its allies in check in the heart of Europe. So this is why our future Prime Minister at that time, Under Secretary of State for External Affairs, said that this treaty is not a pact for war, but a pledge for peace and progress among NATO countries. And a lot of things happened. America put out what was the Marshall Plan to, again, bring about the reconstruction of the war havoc, war-destroyed Europe. And the beneficiary of the Marshall Fund include Germany, France, Italy, and so on and so forth in the rebuilding of the process. So by the time the next Prime Minister comes along, the father of the current Prime Minister, that is Pierre Elliott Trudeau, in 1968, Mr. Trudeau was of the opinion that Europe has now come back on its feet, and there was no need any further for NATO or for the Canadians to be there. And so one of the first things that he did as a Prime Minister was to cut back dramatically Canada's commitment to NATO. He slashed by almost 50% Canada's troop in NATO countries. From 9,800 deployed troops, Canadian troops in NATO, Pierre Elliott Trudeau brought it down to 5,000, And he further said that we need to think about disbanding NATO. We have fulfilled the objective, and we should now be concerned about the defense, protection, and building up of Canada, protecting our three ocean, and our, country within the North American hemisphere. This is Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Okay, so this was 1970s, Fast forward to the 1990s, the Cold War is over, and there were voices, a lot of voices. Pierre Trudeau was no longer the prime minister, but there were a lot of voices in America, in Europe, that possible it is now time to think about disbanding NATO. We have fulfilled our objective, and the same thing happened on the other side. The Warsaw Pact countries were dissolved. So if NATO was not going to be disbanded, that NATO was going to remain, and despite the promises made of NATO not advancing eastward by an inch to Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, by George Bush the senior, 41, the French president, the German chancellor, and so on, the British prime minister, the NATO expansion began in the 1990s under Bill Clinton. The open question is, why wasn't NATO inviting Russia to become a member? And that would have ended all the issue. Russia would have joined the NATO. I mean, Putin has raised that question, going all the way back to Peter the Great in early 18th century, 1700s. Peter the Great was the Tsar who turned his face towards Europe and said, we are a European country. We're part of Europe. But it is Europe that has basically pushed back against Russia from becoming part of the European arrangement. It is Putin who has talked about, in this period, that is the late 1990s and early 2000, going into the Munich Security Conference of 2007, where he basically gave up on the idea. But until then, he was talking about the indivisible security need of Europe. It has to be indivisible. You cannot have a security for Europe at the expense of insecurity for Russia. And you cannot have security for Russia at the expense of insecurity for Europe. His language was the language of the indivisible security. This was the language of George Kennan. This was the language, ironically, of Henry Kissinger and all of these people who have opposed the advancement of NATO eastward. So the dog that does not bark, in that classic formulation of Sherlock Holmes' mystery, Hounds of Baskerville, is the neocon. What is neocon's position, or why couldn't Russia be invited to be a member of NATO? Remember, G7 country minus Japan is basically a European ensemble. Okay? Now, when the Cold War ended, Russia was invited to become a member of G7, and we had a moment in history that was G8. Putin attended G8 conferences. The name G7 became G8 till after the Munich conference and the events of 2005 color revolution in Ukraine and in Georgia, and the resistance of Putin and Russia to that color revolution in Georgia and the first one in Ukraine, that Putin became officially the bad guy, and he was removed from the G8 conference. So we reverted back to G7. Okay, so these are again facts on the table. Who is driving the foreign policy now of the European states? From climate change to build back better, to an economy that is decarbonized, hydrocarbon energy is taken away. Who is driving this policy? This is the World Economic Forum policy. This is the Democratic Party policy. This is now the Canadian government policy. And within this construct of the Davos crowd World Economic Globalist agenda is the policy of regime change in Russia and dismantling Russia. Who is pushing that policy? Well, you raised the question, we have answered it or tried to answer. This is the neocon agenda. And this neocon agenda is heavily pushed by those North American Jews, European Jews, who are, in a sense, committed to ideologically and historically to sort of take the vengeance upon Russia that is of a historical nature. The good, the bad, the ugly, the arguments, well, that is possibly, there is some merit on their side. There are merits on the Russian side. It is a very complex history going back at least over 1,000 years, but then that is the same story whether we are talking about, say, problem of Sri Lanka coming into Canada, or problem of India, Pakistan, and Kashmir coming into Canada, or problems in the Middle East, Shia, Sunni, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Israel coming into Canada. One of the main issue that I basically believe in, and I have taken my own compass on that point as a Canadian, not as a multicultural Canadian, maybe a multi-ethnic Canadian, because I'm, after all, Indian born and brown person as opposed to being a Caucasian, but I see myself as a hyphenated Canadian, and I have taken the position in my writing, in my speaking, in my thinking, that what is Canada's interest, Canada's position in the world, and that would be the similar case if I was an American. What is America's interest? What is America's national interest? Because both Canada and America ultimately is a multi-ethnic society. In America, the slogan, the very principle is part of the American seal, e pluribus unum, from many one, So as a Canadian, what is Canada's interest in Ukraine? Or anywhere in the world, unless we can define it, Canada has no business to be engaged in the conflicts of the old world. And people from the old world, Ukrainians, Indians, Sri Lankans, Palestinians, whoever, Jews in Canada, in America, should leave their grudges, their quarrels, their, problems, wherever they originated from, leave them behind. We are Canadians. But in this war now, it is pretty much clear that it is the tail wagging the Canadian dog. It is the tail wagging the American dog. It is the Ukrainian tail. It is the neocon tail that is wagging the Canadian dog and the American dog. We don't have a bone in this conflict.
Not only that, Salim, if we're going into a conflict, if we're supporting a side, we have to be clear of what is the end game. When do you declare victory? Are you saying that Ukraine must revert back to its 1991 borders, including Crimea and the Novorossiya, all those those two regions and two independent republics, now that Russia has assumed into their body? I mean, there was a celebration. The heads of these governments went to Moscow and were presented to the parliamentarians there and the senators there, and they had this big bash in Red Square with singing and dancing to welcome these people into their bosom. And so what do? So we fight until Russia is out of those areas? That's never going to happen. People have no idea what they're up against here. So I think they have to stand back and reevaluate where they're going here, because if they follow this path, we're going into war with Russia, and it'll be a bloody mess.
Well, you're right. I mean, but again, I didn't want to get into all of that history because, or these are very current issues. And if you have the time, we can get into it. I would just say to whoever is paying attention to us and what we are talking about, and hopefully people will make the effort to look into what we are saying. President Putin laid it all out. If there was an open debate in this country, we would listen to two sides. That's what it is all about. You have to take into account both sides before you come to a judgment. I said we have no bone in this conflict. But if we have a bone in this conflict, that if you want to, the bone in the conflict would be to find a way to settle this conflict. Not we cannot settle it, but help the parties to settle the conflict, right?
Become peacemakers.
Then we have to listen to in at least the two sides, if not all sides, two sides. So in the case of Putin and Russia, they laid it out. This is an operation that began 9 months ago in February. President Putin spoke about it. Once the operation began, his speech is available. If anybody wants to do due diligence, they can pull it up. He spoke to the parliament, that is the Russian parliament, and addressed the Russian people on February the 24th. And he laid it out that this operation is a limited operation. It is not about taking over Ukraine. It is a limited operation, a defensive operation. He invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter. He invoked the principle of self-determination of the UN Charter, Article 1.2. He talked about, as you just now mentioned, the two oblasts or provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk, who had their vote taken in their provinces and who declared their independence as an autonomous sovereign Republic of Luhansk and Donetsk, and appeal to the Russian Federation for support and defense for what they had been undergoing for the previous 8 years, that is the regular bombardment by the Kiev regime that was almost genocidal in nature. Thousands of people had died and had been wounded, and properties had been destroyed, and so on and so forth. And so this operation, the SMO, Special Military Operation, was consistent with the UN Charter, R2P, but he did not invoke R2P, that is responsibility to protect. He invoked Article 51, and he invoked self-determination. The right of self-determination is a protected right in the UN Charter, So he did that. He sent in his forces or supported the forces, the militia of Donetsk and Lugansk, and that's been the operation till September, when the forces had consolidated the position of these two provinces, including two other provinces, Zaporozhye and Kherson, where there were referendums held in all four provinces. Referendum were held, and in those referendum, the decision of the people, as high as 90%, was to accede to join the Russian Federation. On September 30th, again, President Putin, the speech is available, people can pull it up, spoke to the Russian parliament and to the rest of the world, and said it very clearly that Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson are now part of Russia motherland. Any attack on these provinces, on these territories, are attack on Russia, and he will respond accordingly. So he was again laying down the condition. If it was Lester Pearson around, if there was among us a Lester Pearson, say Maxime Bernier, this would be the talking point, the beginning of the talking point, to invite the parties together, in a forum that is neutral and international, and the only forum that is neutral and international would be Geneva under the UN, to call them over and negotiate a ceasefire, a settlement, recognition by Kiev of the right of the people of the Donbass region to have their self-determination, and then to respect the result of that self-determination.
I understood that Ukraine was amenable to negotiations early on in this conflict, but they were persuaded not to continue in that direction by the Democrats and Biden and NATO. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, Boris Johnson went to Kiev and basically told Zelensky not to proceed with any negotiation, because the negotiation were being constructed, or the format was being discussed and being laid out in Istanbul, in Turkey. Turkey is a NATO country. Erdogan was in touch with Putin. Putin was responding to Erdogan. So if Putin is responding to Erdogan, who is a member, a NATO member, Turkey, a long-standing NATO member, Turkey, that means he was through Erdogan sending the message to Brussels in Turkey that, these are the conditions, and we are prepared to negotiate, But Zelensky, who had indicated to Erdogan, according to reports, that there would be participation, Ukraine would be sending delegates, was torpedoed by the NATO countries, and that message was carried by Boris Johnson.
It's funny that during those earlier negotiations, I understood that one of the conditions that Russia put forward was recognition of Crimea, and also the independence, not even as part of Russia, but the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk. And now, what do we see since the negotiations were put aside?
Now basically, Putin has said that there is no further reason to talk, because NATO is not serious, Biden is not serious. And I think...
But my point, Salim, was that since they rejected those negotiations, now they've lost two other regions, and now Luhansk and Donetsk are part of Russia.
Not only
before.
Yeah, not only Lugansk and Donetsk, but also Zaporozhye and Kherson. That entire Donbass region is now, and it is quite possible that once general winter comes in, is already beginning to freeze in Ukraine, or once the ground freezes and military operation can be launched, I believe that there will be a massive military operation that will be launched sometime in November, December, and the war will be wrapped up with the Russian army going right across this region into Odessa, and Ukraine will become landlocked. From the north, if the NATO countries want to launch aggressive actions against Russia, then through Belarus, the Russian forces will come down towards Kyiv, and maybe that would be lead to the capitulation. In fact, the word capitulation now has been used by Putin, that he is going to see to the capitulation, and then lay out the condition. If something can be set up under the control of the Russians, that is a rump state, possibly that will happen. And so that is the end result of this policy that the Western government, that is the NATO government, led by the neocons since 2005, has pushed and brought about. I mean, people like John Mearsheimer and Ray McGovern and Scott Ritter and others had repeatedly pointed out that what is happening is NATO is fighting a proxy war against Russia to the last Ukrainian. It was clearly understood that, you cannot, the argument that Ukraine will fight, take back the land and defeat Russia is as ultimately ludicrous as if saying that, if Mexico went to war against America because Mexico was being used by, say, the Chinese communists to acquire platform targeting America, then if America took action, Mexico would defeat America. It is a proposition that doesn't make any sense. And the answer about 60 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that is right staring at our face. What is the difference between a Soviet missile in Cuba, and that is Cuba turned into a Soviet platform, and Ukraine turned into a NATO platform targeting Russia? What is the difference? What is good for the goose is good for the gander. American president, whether at that time it was John F. Kennedy, but whoever was the American president would lay the red line, had already laid the red line. The red line goes back to John Monroe, 1823, the Monroe Doctrine. And that anyone who crosses that red line would then be facing the wrath of America in terms of what American president and the American people would do in taking action against those breaching the red line that America has laid down. The same principle applies on this side. So what was not understood in Brussels, in Ottawa, in Washington, in Paris, what was it that was not understood? And the answer comes down is, again, if you talk about oligarchs in Eastern Europe, and that is Ukraine, and in Russia, we have oligarchs in the West. And these oligarchs have basically run the affair in the West and is running the affair in the West. And the oligarchs have basically targeted not only what is happening in Ukraine at this point in time we're talking about. The ultimate target of the oligarchs in the West is the Canadian, the American people. It is their impoverishment. It is their turning them into serfs. You cannot question the big chief in Ottawa. You cannot question the big chief in Washington. Our democracy is a facade, is a joke. And, we are just bystander as our lives, as our way of living, as our way of being a society that we believed was open and respectful and transparent, have all been, over the past little while, and the COVID lockdown, vaccine, have now proven that, these are all cosmetic. These have got no real substantive weight behind. I mean, this is outside of our discussion, but the decision that came down from the courts on Brian Peckford's case, with which Maxime Bernier is a co-plaintiff, on the question of the mobility right that was basically breached and subverted, the mobility rights in our Constitution, in our Charter of Rights and Freedom. And the court came down saying that, the question is moot.
Yeah. They're going to appeal that, by the way, aren't they?
Well, it has to be appealed and it has to move up. But, this is where how is it any court can say this question is moot just because the government has suspended it? That means the courts, our justice system, doesn't want to make a pronouncement on what is so clearly, so manifestly a subversion of the rights of the people of Canada.
It's like what Matthias Desmet said. We are living in a mass formation, and there are several going on at one time, but this particular one that we're discussing today is the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And with the media and the government and the vast majority of people supporting Ukraine in this, despite all evidence that should tell them we should be bystanders and not participants, we're in a mass formation. But Matthias Desmet also said that to get out of these kinds of formations, you have to speak out. So I want to thank you, Salim, for speaking out, at least while we still can on this platform. And to our listeners, please share this, get it out there, because as Desmet said, it is only through these voices of the minority in this particular case, can the mass formation be broken. So thank you once again, Salim. Fascinating discussion as always.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much.